Open in a word of prayer. Lord, thanks for this day. Pray you'll bless our time together and give us wisdom and understanding as we approach these sometimes difficult topics. Bless us today. So we're live now. I apologize. There was some little glitches here today. I do a lot of things with my iPad and my phone. To the internet, so that's all on me. So today we're calling this compounding and confounding, and the reason for this is that I sort of used the term compounding interest, which is kind of a big deal in terms of banking. This also is a term that is coming up with just sort of the compounding. The way compounding interest works is, it's like this miracle. You can invest a small amount of money, and back in the days when you could get 15, 18% on a CD, your money would grow very, very quickly. But so we've sort of lost sight of that over the last 20 years where we've had low interest rates. But it's also compounding. The prophetic events are also compounding, and they can be kind of confounding at times. So that's why I chose this. Again, we talk each week about the convergence of events, how quickly things are happening, the acceleration. And I think this is an old quote. It's attributed to Lennon. And again, I don't know if it really was said by Lennon or not, but this is the quote. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. I think we're seeing that happen a lot. And I think as we get closer to the end, in part because of this grid that we have, acceleration, convergence, logistics, understanding, that things are going to happen more and more quickly. Remember this quote that I cite from an old Hemingway novel. I think it's The Sun Also Rises. Two people are talking, and the guy goes, "How did you go bankrupt?" And he says, "Well, I went bankrupt two ways, gradually, then suddenly." I think this is the way Bible prophecy will happen. Things happen gradually, we build up to this, and then boom, all of a sudden it's there. You can see this with some of the things that have happened in the Middle East. For example, there's a controversy over Babylon. Where is Babylon? Some people say the final Babylon is Jerusalem. Some say Babylon is America. Some say Babylon will be where Babylon was in Iraq. That's a very common view. But there's also a logistics part to this, is that if this is going to be a great city that rules over the earth, there has to be something built there. So currently in Babylon and Iraq, there's really virtually nothing there. There's a city adjacent to it, but in the site of old Babylon, there's really just some restored buildings. There was a palace of Saddam Hussein, I think, that was destroyed in the war in Iraq, which began 20 years ago. This week, the big invasion. But the point is that if there's going to be a great city, it's going to take some time to build. So I think that if you hold the view that Babylon is in literal Babylon in Iraq, then it's going to take some time for Babylon to get there. The example would be Dubai. Dubai has taken 30 to 40 years to get to where it is. It's a magnificent city that's been built there in the Middle East, but it takes time. We're seeing the building of Neom. Neom, they say, will be done in 7 years. They're already building it. There's things going on. There's a new building being built in Riyadh called the Mukaaba. It looks very much like some of the Bible prophecy artist representations of the New Jerusalem. But it takes time to build. And the difference between Babylon, there's very little going on. There's some things going on in Baghdad, but that's not Babylon. That's 50 miles away. There's also some talk about building a port down on the Persian Gulf. That thing will take a while to build. It's being built right now. So yeah, they've got the port, but in terms of a city being built, it's just not happening. But there were plans. There was an old blog post many years ago in Newsweek, I think it was. You can probably find it if you dig around archive.org, where there was a suggestion that was being floated around. This is probably 20 years ago when I first saw this, that they wanted to move the UN headquarters to old Babylon, So maybe they will do that. Who knows? Time will tell. And I guess this is where we sort of reference our passage in Daniel chapter 12, that as we get closer to the end, we will be able to have better understanding of how all of these things are going to fit together. Until then, until we have that crystal clear picture, I think that there's going to be differing opinions, and I think that's okay. Also, I have, just so you know, I have some talks coming up in early May. I'll be speaking in Calgary at the Last Days Bible Conference, ldbc.ca. I'll be doing 4 talks. Jesus, Behold, He Came, talking about prophecies related to the first coming of Jesus. Behold, He Comes, prophecies related to the second coming of Jesus, as if I'm going to get everything in 45 minutes that I have. Then, Behold, He Reigns. I will talk about some aspects very general about the millennial kingdom. And then we'll talk about Jerusalem, the city of God. And excuse me here. Gee, I wonder where we got that from. So I'm sure that's going to fall off again because it doesn't look very stable from here. I saw somebody recently and they said, for years I've been here doing this, and that's never fallen off before. So it must have been those crazy ladies yesterday when they had that special event here. They were touching things. So, and then I'm going to talk about Jerusalem, the city of God, in my 4th talk in Calgary. I'll also be doing a conference in Scotland in mid-June. Also speaking at a church in Yorkshire the week before that. You can go to moriel.org and get information about the conference. And then I think I will be doing a conference in Texas in late August, possibly. So that's still in the initial discussion stages. I will focus a little bit more today on Middle East and Israel than we usually do. I have some general things to do because the economic thing is just it's just insane. But I want to show this at the beginning. Now, I wanted to do some more research on what caused this. These are pictures that a friend sent to me from Saskatchewan. I would say that Canada, the provinces go hundreds and hundreds of miles north. I was talking to somebody in Ontario, and I thought, well, we'll meet you, in Toronto. Well, that's a 6 or 8 hour drive, and they still live in Ontario. And then you could drive all the way around Lake Superior, the north part of Lake Superior, and still be in Ontario. So the Canadian provinces are huge. But the person that sent this, I believe she lives in what would be considered southern Saskatchewan. They do see the northern lights on occasion. But the other night, she said it was absolutely mind-blowing. In fact, I'm hearing reports and rumors that people were so struck by what they saw in the sky with the northern lights that the northern lights actually were seen over a large portion of the United States. Now, we didn't see them in Ohio because it's always cloudy this time of year in Ohio. But where it was clear, but especially in Canada, they had these incredible display of northern lights to the extent where some people even, I've heard people had heart attacks because they were so taken away. And my friend who wrote to me said, listen, I've never seen anything like this. I could not take pictures with my phone because the phone would not pick up the details of what I was actually seeing. Now, there's a phenomenon that led to this, and I don't remember the technical name of it. I'll try to talk about it in a future update. But these pictures of northern lights, they're from all over the world. For example, here is northern England, picture of the northern lights that we're seeing also. And there's a phenomenon that's allowing these to be seen further south than normal. I personally don't think I've ever seen the northern lights. We'll be in Canada, hopefully, maybe there'll be some there. But there is a phenomenon going on with the sun that's causing this to happen. And so the question becomes is, we see these things happening all the time that are strange weather events, things in the heavens that people are seeing that are very unusual. And is this part of this package of the end times things that we're going to see? I happen to think that we're going to see more and more of these things. There have been a lot of rain and snow in California. This was Oroville Reservoir last year, and usually the water was just under that bridge, and it had gone down. This is, I think, the largest reservoir in California, and you can see that it was down significantly. But just over this past winter and late winter and early spring, this is what that picture looks like now. You see the difference? That represents an increase in the level of the reservoir of 217 feet. It's pretty amazing. People that I know that live in Southern California say we're just seeing things we've never seen before. People up in Big Bear, Arrowhead, which is a nice drive in the summer, have been trapped up there, some of them for several weeks. Now, I think they're getting things to them now, but for a few weeks there, they couldn't get in or out. People were trapped in their homes. Their homes were literally buried under snow. Very unusual that this happened. I mean, I'm going to California a lot, and I can only remember a couple times when that happened. And California is unusual. Some winters you would drive from my in-laws in Upland, California, down to Temecula or San Diego, and the hills are just bare and dry in the summer. But other times you go out there, because they've had a wet winter, it looks like Hawaii. The hills look like Hawaii. So it's very up and down. But tremendous amount of rain in California. Unfortunately, they're not able to capture all the rain, but it's done a significant dent in the drought that they were having. But there is still a drought in the Southwest, and I want to correct something that I said. I think I might have said it on Tom Hughes the other day, talking about a course called Verde River, I think, it's around Scottsdale. They're essentially out of water. They're kind of an unusual community because I don't think they've had access to get water rights. So the community is really struggling for water. But I've also heard stories. So Arizona still has some water, but there is a big lawsuit going on now between the 7 states that are signatories to the Colorado River Pact because the Colorado River is still in a fairly low state. There's some talk, I saw this maybe a few weeks, a month ago, and I don't know if it's changed, that Glen Canyon Dam was getting close to where they would not be able to use Glen Canyon, the turbines there to generate power because the water level was too low. That's important, I mean, because there's a lot of cities that rely on the power from that. In fact, well, I think I have a slide on that in just a moment. So here's some things that are going on economically. This first article is from the Times of London. And in the Times of London, it says, we avoided a winter gas crisis, but are not out of the woods. The point is this, that they had a relatively mild winter in Europe, and as a result of that, they didn't use as much gas as they need to. That allowed them, as they were trying to replace the Russian gas that was cut off to them, that Germany voluntarily cut themselves off from Russian gas. As that gas needed to be replaced, it was being used to fill gas supplies, sort of like we have the defense gas supply, the defense oil and gas reserves here in the United States. They have that in Europe as well. They were able to fill that up and then use that over the mild winter. But now the problem is, are they going to be able to fill it up before the next winter? And here's an article, this is some of the utilities in the UK saying, listen, we avoided it this last winter, but we're very, very concerned about this winter. In fact, this is from the Financial Times the other day, Friday. Germany warns of winter gas shortages. We can and must do more to save gas. We were lucky to have had a mild winter in Europe. So Germany's having a gas problem, and they foresee gas problems in the future. One of their major industries, BASF, it's a major chemical and fertilizer manufacturer, has essentially announced we're going to shut down in Europe. This employs, they have one of the largest chemical manufacturing facilities on the planet, if not the largest. But because they can't get a dedicated supply of gas or a certain supply of gas, they are just going to shut down. And the talk is they're going to move to China. And of course, we know that China and Russia have entered into some agreements, and China is going to buy Russian gas and oil. Whether that would be enough to make up the supply, there's also the logistics part of getting the gas and oil to China. There's really not a pipeline that's sufficient to deliver the gas. Let me give you an example of the logistics of that. So there was a lot of talk that Israel would build a pipeline through the Eastern Mediterranean at a cost of roughly $9 or $10 billion over a period of 5 years to supply gas to Europe. That pipeline, let me back up. When the supply of gas was shut down, Russia had supplied through pipelines in Nord Stream and elsewhere through Ukraine. I'm going to say somewhere around, I'm just going to pull a number out of my head, 20 trillion cubic feet of gas per year. Israel now has gas wells and reservoirs in the Mediterranean that produce about 41 trillion cubic feet of gas per year. Now, I'm probably a little bit off on this, but I'm just using these numbers as examples. So Israel could make up the difference, but they have to have a way to get it there. So there's two ways. There's liquefied natural gas, but there's only a capacity of currently maybe 2 to 4, whatever the number is, 2 to 4 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas capacity, using some of Egypt's and Israel's trying to build their own. But then the pipeline was going to supply 10 billion cubic feet of gas per year. And that was only going to supply about 1/4 of what the shortfall was going to be when Russian gas got cut off. Now, the U.S. has stepped in, and I talked to you about Amos Hochstein, who is our State Department energy advisor in the Middle East. When Israel was getting ready to build a pipeline, he came in and said about a little over a year ago, said, no, we're not going to support that. We don't want to do these energy projects like this. They're not in it. We're not in it for the long term. And lo and behold, he goes, but, hey, the United States has liquefied natural gas. We've built some extra facilities. We can supply Europe. It just so happens that Amos Hochstein, between the Obama administration and the start of the third Obama administration, the Biden administration, worked for one of these liquefied natural gas companies. So it's all very complicated. Just suffice it to say, mild winter, and we had a pretty mild winter here too. It's not going to be necessary. The problem is not necessarily solved. Things are going to continue. There's also these stories that are appearing, and I have no idea. I don't know if these are plants from people about who bombed Putin's pipeline. There's some talk now that there's this yacht from Ukraine and these Ukrainian people who are unidentified, and they're a patriot group in Ukraine, and they bombed the pipeline. It may be just a distraction. But there are some indications that there was this yacht. But most of the evidence indicates that the United States did this. The other thing that we've been fighting or seeing this last week or so is the banking crisis. Credit Suisse is no longer. They were absorbed into UBS. I think UBS paid $3.8 billion, but then absorbed $5 billion in debt of Credit Suisse. And Credit Suisse has been around for over 150 years. UBS is not without its problems. Remember, it had to be bailed out in the last crisis in 2008. The markets have been up and down. A lot of people are taking deposits from smaller regional banks and putting them into the larger banks. This may be what part of the crisis is designed to do, is to consolidate banking. We also know that there are all these proposals out there to redefine what money is. the money definitions in some of these proposals to modify or amend Uniform Commercial Code in various states. Governor Kristi Noem in South Dakota caught the changes that were being made by her Republican legislature and vetoed the bill. I don't know if that veto has been overridden or whether they can override it, but there are about 20 states where they're proposing these Uniform Commercial Code amendments to redefine money to include central bank digital currencies, but to exclude cryptocurrencies. And it appears that there's a desire to control things. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about that near the end. People at Credit Suisse that own bonds in Credit Suisse have essentially lost all of their investment, and this is the way things are happening. The other thing that happened economically is this insanity of the net zero green energy program. So there were all these reports in the news, hit net zero targets earlier or else. I was reading some of the statistics of how much ore has to be mined to make a battery. And it's in the tons. A lot of these mines use child labor, but that's okay because we're going to save the planet through green energy by having children mine the materials that we need in Central Africa and other countries like the Congo. But there's all this net zero. This will not work. In New York State, the reports this week are that, I think there was a report released, that the proposal for New York State is by 2030 or 2035, they will rely for 70% of their power on renewables, like solar, wind, and maybe geothermal. But solar and wind don't run all the time. You need to have an always-on power source. If you don't have an always-on power source, you have problems. Now, I've had friends writing to me from South Africa over the past year or so, and here's the problem. There are lots and lots of countries in Africa, even South Africa is having rolling blackouts and has for some time, in part because of corruption in the utilities and in the government, but also in part because there's just not enough capacity to get the power distributed around. So they have rolling blackouts of 8 to 10 hours per day. In countries like Nigeria, it's reported that some of these people work at night because that's the only time that the power's on. They don't have the power on during the daytime because you can see during the daytime. So people are having to work at night because that's the only time that they have power. Here's what this article says. This is from the Associated Press. From Zimbabwe, where many must work at night because it's the only time there is power, to Nigeria, where collapses of the grid are frequent, the reliable supply of electricity remains elusive across Africa. The electricity shortages that plague many of Africa's 54 countries are a serious drain on the continent's economic growth, energy experts warn. In recent years, South Africa's power generation has become so inadequate that the continent's most developed economy must cope with rolling power blackouts of 8 to 10 hours per day. About a week ago, our power went out. And it was off for about 10 minutes. I mean, we're running around. What do we do? What do we do? What are we going to do? And we have provision to make, we have a backup, but it didn't work. So we had to have the service guy come out and make sure that it worked. And it's, when you don't have power, even for 10 minutes these days, you're running around like, oh man, how much battery do I have, and that sort of thing. But the International Panel on Climate Change issued a big report this week, and the report was, it's over, it's alarmist, these things are just, it's terrible what's happening, we're never going to recover, we have to do things. In fact, there was a proposal made, this came from The Guardian. There's a guy that's a professor at Georgetown, and if you look at his Twitter account, I think this is what he said about what are we going to do? What are we going to do with these oil companies? And he said this, what's on their ledger in terms of harm, talking about oil companies. This is a left-wing law professor at Georgetown, and he has a book out about this, or a paper that's going to appear in the Harvard Environmental Law Review sometime in 2024, I believe. What's on their ledger in terms of harm, there's nothing like it in human history, said David Arkush, the director of the climate program, a consumer advocacy group, Public Citizen, and one of the paper's authors. And you can see here, he's in climate crisis, financial regulation, Public Citizen, Roosevelt Institute. He's a lefty. I mean, it's clear that he's a lefty. Here's another thing that he said is that this is part of the article that they have, Climate Homicide Prosecuting Big Oil for Climate Deaths. Prosecutors regularly bring homicide charges against individual and corporations whose reckless or negligent acts, this is from the abstract of the article, whose reckless or negligent acts or omissions cause unintentional deaths, as well as those misdemeanors or felonies cause unintentional deaths. Fossil fuel companies learned decades ago that they produced, marketed, and sold let me back up. Fossil fuel companies learned decades ago that what they produced, marketed, and sold would generate globally catastrophic climate change. Rather than alert the public and control their operations, they work to deceive the public about these harms and to prevent regulation of their lethal conduct. So the article, and this was reported in The Guardian, as you can see here, they propose that we're going to bring criminal charges against these guys. A footnote from this is the synthesis report of the International Panel on Climate Change, issued just this week. Very high, listen to how they phrase this, very high emission scenarios have become less likely but cannot be ruled out. Warming levels of greater than 4 degrees centigrade may result from very high emission scenarios, but can also occur from lower emission scenarios if climate sensitivity or carbon cycle feedbacks are higher than the best estimate. So what's the translation of that footnote that they put in this report? Translation of that footnote is, you can't do we're going to make this argument regardless of what happens. If we have high carbon output, we can make our claim. If we have low, we can just say, well, there's other factors that we have to consider. And this is one of the things that, one of the conclusions in this report, widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, oceans, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. Human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. This has led to widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people. Vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to current climate change are disproportionately affected. But the solution is to get them power, but in Africa, how are they going to get power? Well, if you read the article from the Associated Press, they say coal is our friend because it's cheap, it's easy to get to, it's abundant, and we can use that to generate power, which is going to make the Greens just go crazy. By the way, Greta Thunberg this week received an honorary doctorate from a university in Finland. And what did she receive the honorary doctorate in? Was it science? Was it climate science? Was it biology? No. She received an honorary doctorate in theology. Now, think about that. This is a religion. It's the green religion. It's the Mother Earth religion. They constantly use these terms. They constantly speak in religious terms. And now they've confirmed it by giving Greta Thunberg an honorary doctorate in theology. So here's some other things from the summary for policymakers, part of the IPCC report. And they talk about, observe widespread and substantial impacts and related losses and damages attributed to climate change. They got water availability, health and well-being, cities, settlements and infrastructure, biodiversity and ecosystems. Then they have another one, the extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter and different world depends on choices now and near term. So they go to somebody who's 70 in 2020, that's about my age, and they look at what these people are going to, let's say someone who's a child now, what they will experience over the next 70 years. And is the confidence, is it very low that it's going to happen, low, intermediate, high, or very high? And you can understand, they're just extremists. They're trying to accomplish some things. Now, I'm going to turn to the Middle East. I have a bunch of things that I could talk about. I'm going to maybe jump around a little bit. But I want to reiterate something that I think is important, and this is the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal. And the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal is a big deal. This was brokered by China. It's not a military arrangement. They're going to reopen embassies in a couple months. But the question is, who wins in this, who loses? I think it's clear that this is not good for the United States. It's not good for Israel. It's not good for people who oppose the jihadist regime in Tehran. Saudi Arabia did this because they wanted to get certain things out of the deal. Here's an article from Israel Hayom talking about this. Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to renew relations after 7 years of disconnection. Saudi officials said there is a chance for normalization with Israel in the future. So there's a lot of talk about, is Saudi Arabia going to normalize things with Israel? I have a little quote from Amir Avivi interview that he did. But understand that this is very important. This is also another article from Israel Hayom, and I'll just read you the beginning of the translation of this article. That is why attention, it's interesting that this is the terms that's used, that is why attention should be directed to Jerusalem, and first and foremost to the Temple Mount, perhaps the most dangerous explosive in the Middle East. The many warnings lead to the necessary risk of the security system in Israel. The activity leads to many Palestinian casualties, which leads to revenge, further action, and a vicious cycle that just seems to not be able to be broken. These are the days when, in parallel with the operational effort, restraint and restraint, when they use double terms like this in Hebrew, it means really strong restraint. Really strong restraint is needed on the part of the political echelon. This is the beginning of Ramadan. I was reading a report, I don't remember where this morning, that they're already starting to have some disruptions in activities on the Temple Mount. The worshippers at Al-Aqsa have barricaded themselves in, as they usually do this time of year, with rocks and barricades and that sort of thing, and attack the police who come to clear things out. The problem is they sometimes take these rocks, and these are not little, like the little stones that David may have used to bring down the Goliath. These are big rocks, and they throw them in certain places at cars. They can cause tremendous amount of damage. They can kill someone. They're like concrete blocks. And they throw them over the top of the Temple Mount retaining wall onto worshipers down at the hotel at the Western Wall. We're going to see a lot of this. There was an interesting article in the Arab News about a week ago talking about, is this the end of Saudi-Iranian tensions? This is what the editorial says. This is from the editor-in-chief of the Arab News. The Saudi-Iranian agreement achieved with Chinese mediation is a significant development in regional geopolitics, containing an unprecedented commitment from the Iranian side. So there's a lot of talk about this. There was an article a number of years ago. This is from The Atlantic in 2021. Absolute Powers about Mohammed bin Salman. And of course, he's in charge of everything here. This is, it talks about this thing called Vision 2030. This is sort of a key component of this arrangement that China brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Because what does China do? China wants to implement its Belt and Road Initiative. And it sees the developments that Saudi Arabia is building and the things that Saudi Arabia wants to do and the things that Iran is doing already as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, that they all sort of are integrated. And this will ultimately benefit China in terms of trade. Also remember the demographic problem that China is facing. They have a lot of people now. They're the second most populous country on the planet. But they're losing population. Their population estimates may be overstated by over 100 million people. over the next 7 to 10 years, and this is why I think this is prophetically significant, because I think these countries are having demographic problems like China, like Japan, like Iran and Russia. They are sort of at the end where they see that if we're going to preserve our legacy, we need to do something now. And I think this is what's driving it. There were some intelligence reports that I read that said that they were concerned a couple of years ago about Putin because of demographic problems in Russia, and that if he was going to do something with Ukraine, he was going to have to act in the next few years. And of course he did. And we sit here to watch what's happening. So this article, this is by Graham Wood. Again, he's a man of the left, but it's a very interesting thing, a very interesting points that he makes. You can get that at The Atlantic. Doing this is Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, published on March 7th, the Saudi Crown Prince's messages to Israel and Iran. While he says that Israel is a potential ally, he's concerned that the U.S. has not stepped up and done certain things to help protect Saudi Arabia. Because of that, he's trying to, I think, enter into this agreement with Iran to force the United States to take certain actions. I think that's what's behind this. So we have this, this is Seth Frantzman in the Jerusalem Post. A week ago, Iran and Saudi Arabia appear to be headed to a new era of relations after rounds of talks in Baghdad and support for reconciliation coming from Oman and China. Reports that the two countries have now reconciled and agreed to normalize relations after years of hostility is important for the region. The news is being greeted positively in Iranian state media and the Gulf. A big elephant in the room is Saudi Arabia's potential ties with Israel. Reports at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times both indicated this past week that Riyadh has floated the prospect of ties with Israel in exchange for more U.S. support for Riyadh. What might happen now in relation to this potential game changer for the region? It's not likely that Saudi Arabia was seeking to normalize ties with either Iran or Israel. Instead, it had pursued both tracks. And this is not good for anybody. And this is the Wall Street Journal report about the Saudis are seeking an edge with the United States. That's why they're sort of trying to force an issue with the United States. This is, again, I mentioned just a minute ago, a revolution is coming for China's families. It says this: by 2050, living parents and in-laws will outnumber children for middle-aged Chinese men and women. That's going to be a big problem. It's causing problems in their real estate sector. So China's reaching out. They're trying to make these, broker these agreements so they can look like they're the great peacemaker in the world. There's also talk now that Saudis are reaching out to Assad to try to mend that relationship. And there's been a bunch of articles in various news outlets this week about that. So this is part of the, this is an interesting article. Iran-Saudi rapprochement will deal a death blow to the dollar. What's happening with China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia is not good for the United States. For years, the United States has been able to trade and prosper quite a bit on the fact that its currency, the dollar, was the world's reserve currency. Before the dollar, it was the British pound sterling. And there was a transition period, but for the last at least 70 or so years, the dollar has been king. When agreements were being made with Saudi Arabia about the recently discovered oil back in the 1930s after the creation of the Saudi kingdom, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think about 1932, the United States made defense commitments to Saudi Arabia. We will protect you from your enemies if you trade oil and dollars. And that's been the case pretty much until just the last couple of months. So there's a lot of people who've been trying to chip away at the dollar's reserve currency status. How quickly that will happen, I don't know. I think eventually it will happen. I think we're seeing with the things going on in the banking sector, you're going to see a concern about money. And the United States money is based on the full faith and credit of the United States government. It doesn't have gold backing it. We were taken off the gold standard 50 years ago by Richard Nixon and the Bretton Woods Agreement. I think it was the Bretton Woods Agreement. So there's not any, you used to be able to get gold or silver for your money, your paper dollars. But not anymore. It's fiat currency. It's essentially paper. Eventually, that game that you kind of roll through catches up with you. What will happen then, I think, is that commodities, deliverables, actual things that exist will be important. That's why China and Russia have been buying a lot of gold. They're trying to get things shifted to a gold standard where there are precious metals to back the currency. That will be very attractive. I also think that certain commodities like gas and oil will become very important as backing of currency. If that happens, what you've seen in this explosion of things in the Middle East, and this is where I think it kind of plays into Bible prophecy, is you will see an explosion in the value of what Saudi Arabia has. Now, some people say they're running out of oil. I don't know whether that's true or not. It may be. They're trying to shift things to other ways of making money. They're trying to shift to mining ore, gold, minerals, that sort of thing, tourism. They have plans. This is what Mohammed bin Salman has been trying to do since he became crown prince, in 2017, is to diversify the Saudi economy. But this article points out is that if the dollar does decline, if the dollar loses confidence of people in the world, which I think is happening, it will make what happened, the China broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia, important, because Iran has a lot of oil. So I think the top countries in the world that have oil reserves, you have Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. Who's pushing to get things in Venezuela? Iran. So they're going to try to corner the market on oil. So here's what this article says. The People's Republic regards Vision 2030 as complementary to its Belt and Road Initiative due to Mohammed bin Salman's focus on real sector investments for preemptively diversifying the Saudi economy away from its presently disproportionate dependence on oil exports. His country's location at the crossroads of Afro-Eurasia also makes investments there extremely attractive from the perspective of China's logistical interest, hence its massive commitment to his comprehensive economic reform policy. So here's a little graphic about the China Belt and Road Initiative. You can see Saudi Arabia there. You can also see Tehran. There was a great article back in 2017 or 18 in the South China Morning Post. You can find it online. The 5 main projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, I've talked about them a little bit. The first one is a railway to London under the article title, Plugging China into Europe. And so what they talk about is this a great railway that they're going to take all the way across Asia, all the way to London. And you can see that it's a significant, we're talking 8,500, 9,000 miles. It's going to go across the Himalayan desert or plateau, then the Tibetan plateau, then some deserts. That's a picture of some of the terrain that it has to cross. And then it's going to get up here to this port in Kazakhstan called Korgos, which is the largest inland port in the world. And it will continue. It will go up to Astana. Remember, Astana is an important city. I think it's going to become more important. This is where they have those kind of strange, for lack of a better term, Masonic-looking buildings, the Hall of Peace. That's where the Pope and a bunch of religious leaders recently met. And there's talk, some people have talked about moving the UN to Astana in Kazakhstan. So it's going to go all the way across Russia. It'll go through, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name. And then it's also going to go through this city called Kazan. That's a very important city to Russia. Kazan, this is where that icon, the most revered icon in the Russian Orthodox Church, resided for many years, now a replica. This was an icon, and eventually somehow a replica of this ended up with the Fatima people in Fatima, and it was given to Pope John Paul II. And when you saw the picture there of when he met with Putin, there was the Lady of Kazan. So this is an incredible project that they're going to have. There's also another project that is part of this. A link to Guadalajara Port. This is down on the Indian Ocean, south of Pakistan, between Pakistan and Iran. There's a giant port that they're going to, they're building there. There's also a railway to Tehran. There's a Central Asian gas pipeline. There was also some talk during the talks between Xi and Putin this week about a pipeline from Russia to China. I don't know that Putin didn't really commit to that, but you can see that there's one here that goes from the Caspian Sea, which is gas and oil rich. And then this is Korgos. This is that biggest dry port in the world. There were also talks this week, and I don't have anything to report on this because I haven't really seen any reports with everything else going on. Iran joins four-way Moscow talks with Turkey and Syria. So this week, Putin and Xi met. This is an article from Ronald Russell Mead a couple of weeks in late February, almost a month ago. War in the Middle East is closer than you think. And here's a picture. There's a good article in the Cradle. I won't go into it in detail. But essentially it says, listen, this is a big deal, this deal between Russia and China. So here's a picture of what they meant. This is the Financial Times analysis of it. I'll just read a couple paragraphs from that. You can see Putin's back, and now he's meeting with people at the end of that giant table that he had where he used to sit at the other end. So the real meaning, so this is what he says. Echoing Mao, Xi often claims that the East is rising and the West is declining. Xi, like Mao and Putin, also believes that Russia and China share an interest in accelerating the decline of Western power. And part of that is because they see the grip on their own power going away demographically. They're smart people. They know what's going on. Those comments, it says, might read like an advanced copy of the remarks that Xi Jinping intends to make during his visit to Moscow this week. In fact, they come from a speech made by another Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, visiting Moscow in 1957. The really sensitive question is, will be Putin's request for Chinese weapons, in particular artillery shells and missiles, to make up for shortages that are undermining Russia's war effort. The U.S. warned last month that China was considering making this move. Whatever Putin and Xi agree is likely to remain a closely guarded secret. The pictures of Xi and Putin together in Moscow will send a clear message. Russia and China remain close partners linked by their joint hostility to America and its allies. And this is another article from the Financial Times. The sanctions that were imposed, they didn't really work that well, and they were essentially forcing Russia into agreements with Iran and China. And I think the Russia-Iran agreement does have a lot of prophetic significance. China wants to give Russia weapons because, like Iran sells weapons to Russia. They get things in return. They get an economic relationship. There's a corridor that they've developed for trade, which all fits into the Belt and Road Initiative. But by having their weapons used in Ukraine, they get data about how well their weapons are performing. China has done also a lot of military buildup, but their weapons haven't really been tested in the field. So now they will sell weapons potentially to Russia to be used in Ukraine, and they will also get data on their things. Now, here's an interview. I'm going to try to jump into the middle of this. This is Amir Avivi 2 weeks ago with Caroline Glick on her Middle East News Hour, the Caroline Glick Show. And they were talking about it, but I want you to listen to what he says about where this is going. Caroline starts off talking about the nuclear capabilities of Iran, that they're really ready to go. And then General Avivi, Amir Avivi, has some things to say about that. So I'm going to try to jump into the middle of this.
By saying, well, they're 12 days.
The weak link West decide to move to build big bases in the Philippines and challenge directly the Chinese, which is not a smart idea to do at all, especially with, the problems they have industrially and so on. I was saying, listen, guys, you want to build deterrence? Pick up on the easiest target. That's
Right.
Iran. Okay?
Right.
Don't pick up. Now, let's see what happens if the U.S. decides to listen to our advice and build a coalition here in the Middle East with the huge capabilities of Israel, the huge capabilities of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We are all very, very powerful and strong. It's not only the U.S. And we challenge the weak link. The weak link is Iran. This will affect everything. One, it will affect the Ukrainian war. The Russians cannot succeed without Iran. If you take on Iran, it will immediately affect what's happening in Ukraine.
Okay.
If you take on Iran, this will deter China from further expansion in the East, because they say, okay, these guys actually are willing to use power. So if they use power against Iran, or even not use, just pose a credible threat on Iran, this is a game changer. But there is also one other thing. Basically, the Middle East needs the US to stand with us against the Iranians. And for that, the Saudis are saying we are willing to offer a huge peace agreement. Not only with us, we are the leaders of the Sunni world. So we are willing to offer a peace agreement with us, Pakistan, Indonesia, Oman. This is a global peace agreement that will create a huge alliance for the US, will bring to the White House a huge peace agreement. But it's not only about that. They are saying we're willing to dramatically expand the production of oil. This will take prices down. We're willing to open new route of commerce, which Biden talked about when he visited Israel. He did this Zoom with India, UAE, and Israel, talking about a new route of global trade. This is needed. It takes a month off instead of going through Egypt. This is all something that we have to offer the administration. And this is the cheaper and easiest way for them to build deterrence, get peace agreements, improve economy. This is one option. Let's see what is the alternative. The alternative that they continue to sit, on the fence, along the lines, not really doing anything and not challenging this Eastern challenge. The result will be, at the end of the day, that Israel will have to attack by its own. And if we do it by our own, this will destabilize the whole Middle East. This will bring a regional war with Hezbollah, with Hamas, Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq. And this will bring waves of, economic fall, recession to all the world. So the US will find itself in a year or two in election with the Middle East completely destabilized, with oil prices rising, with the recession. And for what? Instead of stability, peace, deterrence, trade routes, and all of that. This is the choices. Now, when I talk about that, first of all, I must say that when I visited Washington last week, people were listening very
well. You can go to Caroline Glick's. I think it was recorded around March 11th. Around March 11th. I'm not sure if that's exactly right. It might have been the 14th. Anyway, it was recorded a couple weeks ago. But it was true. He talks about, listen, what we really need here, what did he say? A big peace agreement involving everybody, because this is the way we're going to do it. And we can offer things, we can offer these routes for trade. It's interesting, this is a meeting between the foreign ministers of Iran on the left and Turkey on the right. And Tehran warned Israel against presence in the Caucasus region. That's the area of southern Russia and Azerbaijan. And the question becomes, how is Israel going to attack Iran? And the Azerbaijani ambassador came out and said, you're not going to use bases in our country. I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen. This is an article from the Russian Gazette talking about, well, what did the effect of sanctions had? And this is what it says. Their banks are collapsing and we have a rally. Sanctions have given Russia an advantage over the West. The forced independence of the Russian financial system from the trajectory of global markets enhances the resilience of our banks. The liquidity of the system remains at a high level, and the central bank rate of 7.5% is relatively low by standards of world economies. So that's what's been true. Now, there's this judicial reform thing. I want to spend just a little bit of time on this, and I have some stuff on artificial intelligence I don't think I'm going to get to. By the way, we have a business meeting here at the church today. That's why I'm doing this early. We don't want to make people wait around until after my prophecy update is over at 2 o'clock or whenever it is I eventually get finished. So that's why we're doing it early today. But this judicial reform is a very big deal. I'm probably going to go about 12 more minutes. I have a video to play. Netanyahu went to the UK this week. UK said, you need to settle this thing. You need to stop this judicial reform. There was reports, this was later in the week, that Netanyahu and Gallant, he's a member of Likud, he's the defense minister of Israel, were going to address the nation. But then there were reports started to surface that Gallant was going to come out and say, we need to stop the judicial reform. And in fact, he's come out and said that. We need to stop judicial reform. We can't go forward. Netanyahu has been barred by the Supreme Court. He's under indictment, has been for years. The cases, most reports I read say the cases aren't going anywhere, but that doesn't make any difference. It's just the fact that he's going to be indicted. I think we sort of have something happening in our own country about the same thing. Well, we'll just indict him, and that's as good as a conviction. Well, it's not as good as a conviction, and you just don't indict him, but this is what they did. And so they don't have a law in Israel that says if you've been indicted, you can't serve. Because if it was that easy, they would just indict everybody. What's the old saying that they have in the law here in the United States, that if you go to a grand jury, you could indict a ham sandwich, meaning you don't even need an animated person who's done anything. You just have a ham sandwich sitting there on the table, and you can indict it for having committed a crime. I guess making people want to eat something that's fattening or something like that. So there's this rift now that's developed between Netanyahu and Gallant. The question is Netanyahu going to fire Gallant? So what happened was Netanyahu came back, and instead of meeting with Gallant, doing something with Gallant, he went in front of the country. And he said some things here. Just here's some of the quotes from his talk that he had. I say this evening, and I believe that it is possible to enact a reform that will answer both sides. A reform that will restore balance, that will restore the proper balance between the authorities, and on the other hand, safeguard, and I say beyond that, not just safeguard, but ensure the individual rights of every citizen in the country. So people are concerned, look, if the right-leaning parties, they're a bunch of extremists in the view of a lot of people, they want to essentially make the Torah the law of Israel, so that you have to act according to the law in the Torah. There was also a report this week that a couple members in some of the parties, one of the parties in Netanyahu's coalition, had proposed a law to ban the sharing of the gospel in Israel, and that if you did so, you could be punished by up to a year in jail, and if you did it with a child, it would be up to 2 years in jail. Now, Netanyahu, to his credit, came out almost immediately as that proposed law surfaced and said, I'm not going to support that. Well, without his support, they'll never get the votes that they need to pass that, so the law has essentially been withdrawn. But it was directed at Christians, so this is concerning. And so people in the center and on the left and the center-right see something like this happening, and are saying, well, what other rights are these people in Netanyahu's coalition going to come at? Dershowitz, Alan Dershowitz, I would call him a classic liberal, a man of the left. He would never vote for a Republican. I mean, you could have the worst person in the world, well, running in the Democratic Party for president, and Dershowitz would vote for him. But Dershowitz has a new book out, and he says, listen, what the left has done in the United States and weaponizing the judicial system against their opponents on the right, particularly with Russiagate and those type of investigations, is awful. And he weighed in and he said, this proposed thing from New York, this prosecutor, it's just complete nonsense. It's laughable. And Dershowitz offered, by the way, to go to Israel and sit down with the parties and mediate some kind of a compromise on judicial reform that everybody, almost everybody in Israel agrees. Even on the left, they propose judicial reform because they think it's out of control. Dershowitz said this: if all of these reforms were enacted, and I oppose most but not all of them, it would turn Israel into, God forbid, Canada or New Zealand or Australia or many European countries. It would not turn it into Poland. It would not turn it into an autocratic country. But that's the argument that everybody's making in these giant protests. Netanyahu says, look, in every democracy in the world, the legislative branch of government has some say in the appointment of judges and the laws. And so the problem here is it's out of balance. The Supreme Court is way out of balance. You see these protests. Herzog weighed in and initially said we need to compromise. Now he comes out and says these things are a nightmare. Here's an ad from Israel Hayom about a rally that's took place today, I guess, against the reform package. These are some articles from Israel Hayom. You can see the picture of these massive protests. And Netanyahu went to the UK. He had a meeting with Sunak, and here's an editorial cartoon from Israel Hayom showing the Attorney General of Israel, who's appointed by the judges, and she says, Netanyahu, you cannot participate in negotiations or lobbying or anything about these judicial reforms because of some agreement. Now, I don't know that that's what the agreement says, but that's what she says. You can't do that. And so here's a picture of her sneaking around, listening to what Netanyahu said. Is he violating my order? How dare the prime minister of Israel disobey the attorney general of Israel, who's appointed by the judges? You see the conflict that's there. So she came out and she said that Netanyahu's speech that I was just playing you it's a violation of her order, because he came out and said, I'm going to participate in the negotiations. Enough of this nonsense. I'm going to do it. And she came out and said, you can't do that because you have a conflict of interest. You might benefit personally from the judicial reforms that you want to enact, which led Gadi Taub, who was a man of the left for many years, to tweet this, which I thought was a very intelligent tweet. And he said this: when will the ombudsman, that's the attorney general, announce that the court cannot deal with the reform because it has a conflict of interest? Do you see how it's a one-way street with the court? And effectively what you have the ability of judges to appoint judges. Now the coalition has come out with some moderation. They've increased the number of people on the committee. They give a majority to the coalition. I think 3 members of the Knesset, then they give 2 from the minority parties in the Knesset, get to appoint it. And right now what happens is you need 7 votes of approval out of a committee of 9. The judges have 3. The judges always vote together, so they have effectively a veto over who gets appointed. And it's led to a lot of abuse. Gallant, this may bring down the coalition and they may head to governments. This is Nasrallah a couple of weeks ago saying, hey, listen, the end of the Zionist regime is near because we've got our missiles, we're ready to go. Amir Avivi talked about that. His Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel, and these red-robed handmaidens are all over the place. So here's an interview. I will probably close with this because I'm out of time. So this is about 6 minutes. So here we go. This is Gadi Taub, who used to write for Haaretz. He was a man of the left. He's now on the right. And he's interviewing David Wu, who's a guy who opines on a lot of things. And he said, what do you think of all this stuff that's going on in Israel? Here's their interview.
I think it's completely ridiculous what the left has been saying of late here in Israel, that judicial reform is going to bring about the destruction of the Israeli economy.
Can you, despite not agreeing with the argument, can you imagine what it is based on? What's the logic behind the idea that a judicial reform of this kind can have such an impact on the economy?
I think, first of all, let me just give you my overall, I think, interpretation reading of what's actually going on here in Israel. And the only thing that can destroy this economy is if the left, goes all the way to weaponize the economy in order to destroy, everything that is valuable in this country in order to basically retain power. I think what is going on here, there's no question, it's about a power struggle. What is going to bring down the economy is not the judicial reform itself, but rather the fact that the left is willing to, again, basically push the economy to the brink in order to basically take the government hostage in order to force themselves into this process. I think this is a very important thing. This is what your viewers need to understand. This is a very big difference. Because I can give you an example. I mean, a perfect example, right? Right now, you've got people, elite in Israel, who are comparing Israel with Turkey. I think that comparison is almost like idiotic. I can tell you a much fairer comparison. You know what the country is? Singapore. Singapore,
And he goes on to say that Singapore is a very controlling country. They control it. You can't even chew gum in public. And you'll go to jail if you do. But they're considered a great democracy. And they're a great economy, but Israel has a great economy too. So he goes on to say listen, the left is willing to completely tear down the country. They have reservists, thousands of them, reservists in the IDF and the Israeli Air Force have refused to show up for service. At the time where there's this tension with Iran. Iran may be at breakout nuclear capability. What's Israel going to do? Are they going to attack? If they attack, then they're at a war. But what if the reservists aren't showing up because, we don't consider this to be a legitimate government? This is the same thing that the left did with President Trump, if you remember. They made this narrative, he's going to attack Iran. He's going to attack Iran. He's going to take us into war in the last few weeks of his term of office. And you had the Joint Chief of Staff, Milley guys, standing up there saying, we're not going to do what he says. Because, we're better than the president. And now the defense minister in Israel is coming out and saying, I don't support this judicial reform. It's a big problem. One thing, since I cut the video short, I have 2 minutes, so I'll do this. France is in major turmoil. Germany is in turmoil. Germany has a problem with Deutsche Bank. It's going down. But France is in turmoil. There are protests all over the place. King Charles was supposed to go to Israel. Macron, look at what it says. On day of humiliation, French president cancels first state visit and is mocked over Marie Antoinette moment as he hides a 2,100-pound watch in a TV interview. He actually took it off under the table. He realized, when I make a point with this hand, they can see my expensive watch. Chaos reigns in France. And look at this. Charles III, do you know the guillotine? That's graffiti. And it's interesting. We know in the end times, by the way, that there's this beheading that takes place. And what are the cultures that have had a lot of beheadings? Well, we know the Islamic cultures, right? We know France. France, back in the French Revolution, probably beheaded 300,000 people over a period, I don't know how many year period of time. And when you go to, it was one of the things that kind of struck me about our tour of London. We're taking a tour of London and they kept saying, over here, this is where the king beheaded one of his wives or ex-wives. And over here, this is where they found, 500 bodies by the London Bridge, or I don't know what the number was. It was in the hundreds that had been beheaded. So there was a pretty dark history to large parts of London. But France is really in a bit of a state of meltdown. And what's going to happen? Now, if you remember back in 2017, The Economist came out with this. And so a lot of people say, there's Macron, he must be the Antichrist, right? So I did a little magic with Photoshop this week. And this is what I think Macron's, he's sort of sinking beneath the water here a little bit. But it is, this is an article from Politico Europe after Macron, the deluge. What's going to happen? They say it's about pension reform, but it's really more. So what's happening is because of all the tension, European countries are coming together. Now, they're not putting a lot of money to this, about 8 billion euros, I think, which is not really much in defense spending. But they're saying, maybe we need to get together and get a defense package going because we've got problems. We've got Russia, we've got all this tension with Iran and that sort of thing. We've had all this problem with immigration from certain countries that have a religious persuasion against us. And then also, this is in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, Japan and Germany are preparing for war. So the Pox Biden. I'm going to do a midweek update this week. I'm going to finish now. But I'm going to start off with an article by one of our great friends, Bill Gates, about the age of AI has begun. I'm telling you folks, what is happening in the AI space right now is very concerning. So look for something maybe Monday night or Tuesday night. I'll do a thing dedicated solely, I think, just to, unless, of course, things start to melt down, dedicated to AI. It is absolutely incredible. By the way, did you see this? 150,000 jobs in the tech industry were lost in the first 3 months of 2023. It's amazing. Amazon just announced they're going to shed another. So here's AI. This is Chat GPT. You're fired. Oops, that's not really the correct way. It should say you're fired. But we'll talk about this in an update this week. Listen, a lot of things going on. You see things with Revelation 13, Ezekiel 38, the alignment of the nations. You see the push to get the Abraham Accords expanded. They were talking about expanding it to 4 other countries this week. I do think that that's prophetically significant, maybe related to Psalm 83. We'll talk about that. So listen, stay calm. God's in control, but it's going to be a rough ride, I think. I think we need to be honest about that. So you need to make some preparation. So let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for this day. We pray that you will give us wisdom to act in an evil age. Give us opportunities to share the gospel with those around us, because time may be very short for people to make a decision about their eternity. Help us to stay true to your word. And as it says in Romans, to stand firm in the faith and act like men. Give us that strength to do that. Help us to remember to always put on the whole armor of God every day. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.